order. You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man.
Now, more than 2.5 years after being set up, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse in England and Wales has begun holding its first hearings. The inquiry was prompted by the Jimmy Savile scandal and is expected to take 5 years to complete. Today's sessions focused on the abuse of British children sent abroad after the Second World War. But the hearing has been marred by a serious data breach. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons is in central London for us now. Tom.
Yes, Clive, this inquiry has been accused of concentrating too much on the past and not enough on the protection of children here and now. But it says that those children that were sent abroad after the Second World War for a better life are now reaching their elderly years and are still suffering from the effects of what happened to them. And the inquiry says they deserve an investigation into what happened after waiting for 60 years. It is a cruel detail that some of Britain's child migrants were falsely told their parents had died. For decades there have been efforts to reunite them with their British families. Now an inquiry with many of the powers of a court is sitting down to the job of understanding why it happened.
Child migration programmes were large-scale schemes in which thousands of children, many of them vulnerable, poor, abandoned, illegitimate or in the care of the state, were systematically and permanently migrated to remote parts of the British Empire.
The liner Asturias arrives at Fremantle from Great Britain with 931 new migrants for this country.
We anticipate that you will hear evidence that these children were put on board ships departing from England and Wales without being given any real understanding of where they were going, what they were doing or why they were being sent.
More than 4,000 ended up in farm schools or remote religious institutions, mainly in Australia. Physical labour, poor food, mistreatment. This is what they'll tell the inquiry.
That we were sent to what we can only describe as labour camps, where we were starved, beaten and abused in despicable ways.
Sexual abuse, worst at religious institutions like this one, is what this inquiry is really about. It's never been examined in detail.
I was only 10. This man in a suit, he came to see me and he says, his mother's dead, you know, so how'd you like to go to Australia? The sun's...
In 2011, the story of a Nottinghamshire social worker, Margaret Humphreys' battle to uncover the scandal was made into a feature film. She has campaigned for 30 years for today's hearings.
We want to know what's happened, we want to know who did it, and we want to know who covered it up for so long. Of course we need to know about it. There are consequences for children today.
But this is just the start of something bigger. This inquiry will cover abuse in Lambeth and Nottinghamshire children's homes, schools in Rochdale, custodial institutions, residential schools, and both the Anglican and Catholic churches. Yet resignations and controversy have delayed this work. And today there was another untimely embarrassment. The inquiry sent out an email in which it was possible to read the email addresses of everyone who received it, including some people who have been sexually abused and are entitled to legal anonymity. The inquiry has had to report itself to the Information Commissioner.
These are the very people that we're supposed to be relying on to keep our data safe, especially the details about our abuse. And so it has made some survivors very worried.
Many never recover.
And it distracts from the inquiry's real work.
And are permanently afflicted with guilt, shame, diminished self-confidence, low self-esteem.
Which is hard enough. Tom Simons, BBC News, at the Child Abuse Inquiry.
They were torn from their families and shipped to far-flung corners of the empire. But for thousands of vulnerable children, their journeys ended in horrific abuse. An inquiry into this period of Britain's shameful history has heard some children suffered torture, sexual abuse and slavery. And they claim, even though the authorities knew what was happening, they did nothing. One survivor broke down as he told the hearing many of them would never recover. Kamian Zeram has this report.
I'd be surprised if the figure of the rate of sexual abuse of children...
David Hill, separated from his mother when he was 12 and sent to Australia, addressing the inquiry into historic child sex abuse.
The second thing I hope this inquiry can do is promote an understanding
They've waited a lifetime for this, and still it is so tough to talk about.
Of the long-term consequences and suffering of those who were sexually abused. Many never recover and are permanently afflicted with guilt, shame, diminished self-confidence, low self-esteem, fear and trauma.
40 boys and girls are saying goodbye, and the Australian Deputy High Commissioner speeds them on their way down under. These youngsters...
Starting way back in the 1600s, 150,000 British children were scattered across the colonies, to Canada, to New Zealand, to Australia, as part of official child migration programs.
Yes, they're feeling happy, their hopes are high, their future bright.
But some claim that at farm schools like the now notorious Fairbridge, as many as 60% of British child migrants were abused. In 2015, Fairbridge survivors won a £15 million payout, the largest in Australian legal history. And back in the UK, in 2010, on behalf of the British government, Prime Minister Gordon Brown offered an apology.
We are truly sorry. They were let down. We are sorry they were allowed to be sent away at the time they were most vulnerable. We are sorry that instead of caring for them, this country turned its back. And we're sorry that the voices of these children were not always heard.
And most importantly, 12 of...
Some of the victims have now passed away and will never be heard. Today marks the first of 13 separate inquiries into historic child sex abuse. David Hill wants more than apologies. He wants the truth.
We'll never be able to undo the great wrong that was done to these children. But what is important to the survivors of sexual abuse is where this inquiry is satisfied with the evidence, name the villains. Many of them are beyond the grave and therefore beyond the law, but it would bring a great deal of comfort to the people who as children were victims of these people if they were named and shamed. Thank you.
After years of delays, the inquiry into historic child sexual abuse has finally begun. But the background to this, in fact, goes back centuries. It starts with how British authorities tried to build the empire. They deported white British children to try and build white British colonies. And the inquiry heard today how these children were systematically abused.
My name is Alexis J. and I'm the chair of the Independent Inquiry.
It is for Professor Alexis J. and her team to evaluate these claims of systemic abuse. She is its fourth chair, and the inquiry's been beset with problems. Some say it's just too big and unfocused, with 13 separate strands. It was set up by Parliament, but one of the main survivors groups pulled out, describing it as a botch job. And today, an email was sent, accidentally naming potential victims. But it has now started, with the British government providing its first statement. Child migration is wrong, their lawyer told the inquiry. It should not have been sanctioned or facilitated.
Kamian Zeram reporting. Well, joining us now is Oliver Cosgrove, who was selected to be sent to Australia in 1952 at the age of 3, travelling when he was just 4. There he was subjected to sexual and physical abuse throughout his childhood at the hands of the Christian Brothers who ran the school he attended. Today, his lawyer spoke to the inquiry on his behalf. Oliver Cosgrove, can you remember the ship?
No.
Can you remember arriving in Australia?
No.
And is that because you chose to rub it out?
It may have been. I'm not sure. I'm told by medical people that I had selective amnesia at the time.
When you went to school, where you clearly suffered at times, did you have any sense that any other child in that school had had the same experience as you?
Being a migrant, yes.
A forced migrant?
Yes, most of us knew that we were migrants.
So did you talk to each other about being wrenched from home and...
No, I wasn't wrenched from home. I was in an orphanage here in the first place. But there wasn't much discussion among the students in the schools about anything, really, because you try to suppress discussion like that.
You didn't really ever want to go over it until you spoke to a psychiatrist?
Yes.
And then was that some kind of liberation?
Some kind, yes.
I mean, the extraordinary thing is that even when you left school, you were dragooned into the army.
Yes.
To fight in Vietnam.
Yes. With lots of other Australians.
How do you feel now about testifying to this inquiry? Do you have any confidence that it will do anything at all to remedy what you've suffered?
To remedy, that's a big task for the inquiry. I'm glad that it's happened. I'm glad that it's started. I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. What comes out of it is probably more important to us than it's just started.
The barrister that we heard just at the top of the programme was saying that the people who were to blame need to be named.
Oh, indeed.
That was another victim, in fact, saying that, I'm sorry.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, indeed.
And do you feel that?
I do. I think not naming them continues the process of impunity that the perpetrators and the people that were responsible for the child care, they need to, this culture of impunity needs to be broken.
This inquiry has been through many troubles before it got to this day. Do you have confidence that it can at least, if not deliver justice, deliver what you want in terms of some kind of explanation as to what happened?
I think an inquiry like this will only deal with, give quality results if it gets quality evidence. And I really do hope that the quality evidence comes forth from all the participants in the inquiry. And I think if we don't get people covering it up, continuing covering it up and continuing to misrepresent and practice subversion, I think we'll probably get somewhere.
Did you ever think of trying to come back here?
No.
But you did find your birth family?
Yes, I did.
But not until your mother had died?
Yes. My mother died 6 months before I was told where my family was.
Do you think even then, perhaps, people waited until that moment before telling you?
It's tempting to think that, but I have no proof.
How different could your life have been, do you think?
I think my life could have been much better had I experienced a loving family. I think my life would have been better if I'd been educated by people who had an interest in my capabilities and my interests. I think my life would have been better if I'd been treated with respect. And I think my life would have been better all around had I not gone to Australia under those circumstances.
Oliver Cosgrove, thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you.